Route 66 stretches across the American heartland like a concrete ribbon of nostalgia, connecting Chicago to Los Angeles through 8 states and 3 time zones. For decades, it served as the main artery for those seeking new lives in the West, carrying migrants, dreamers, and drifters across the vast emptiness of the Midwest. But along its weathered asphalt, particularly through the fog-shrouded stretches of central Illinois, something else rides. Something that has been hitchhiking for far longer than it should be possible. The late 1970s were a time of transition for Route 66. The interstate highway system had already begun siphoning traffic away from the historic road, leaving behind a trail of shuttered diners, abandoned gas stations, and forgotten motels slowly surrendering to decay. The once vibrant corridor of American commerce had become a ghost road, traveled primarily by truckers who knew its shortcuts and locals who'd never left. Richard Morrison was one of those truckers. A veteran of 23 years on the road, he'd driven every mile of Route 66 more times than he could count, hauling everything from livestock to machinery across the Midwest. He was a practical man, grounded in the tangible realities of diesel engines, delivery schedules, and truck stop coffee. He didn't believe in ghosts, didn't have patience for superstition, and considered himself immune to the kind of roadside folklore that spooked younger drivers. That certainty died on a frigid October night in 1978. Richard's log showed he'd left Springfield, Illinois just after midnight, heading northeast toward Chicago with a load of agricultural equipment. The weather had turned savage that evening, unseasonably cold for early October with temperatures plunging into the low 30s. A thick fog had rolled in from the surrounding farmland, the kind of dense, impenetrable mist that transforms familiar roads into alien landscapes. His 18-wheeler crawled along Route 66 at barely 40 miles per hour, headlights struggling to penetrate more than 20 feet ahead. The fog seemed to have substance, pressing against the windshield like a living thing. On both sides of the highway, abandoned structures loomed out of the murk and disappeared just as quickly. The skeletal remains of businesses that had thrived when Route 66 was America's main street. Richard had been driving for about 40 minutes when his headlights caught something that made him ease off the accelerator. A figure, standing at the roadside, thumb extended in the universal gesture of the hitchhiker. Even from a distance, he could tell it was a young woman. She wore a pale coat that seemed to almost glow in the fog, and she stood perfectly still, not shivering despite the brutal cold, not moving except for that outstretched thumb. There was something profoundly wrong about her stillness, something that triggered a primitive alarm in Richard's mind. His first instinct was to keep driving. He'd picked up hitchhikers before. It was a different era when roadside thumb travel was common. But something about this situation felt off. The isolation, the fog, the unnatural stillness of her posture. Every instinct screamed at him to press the accelerator and leave her in his rearview mirror. But Richard was also a decent man, raised with Midwestern values about helping neighbors and looking out for folks in trouble. The temperature was dropping, the fog was worsening, and leaving someone stranded on this desolate stretch felt like a death sentence. Against his better judgment, he began braking. The air brakes hissing as the massive truck slowed to a stop about 20 feet past where she stood. Richard waited, watching his side mirror, expecting to see her walk toward the truck. She didn't. For several long seconds, she simply stood there, that pale coat luminous in the red glow of his taillights. Then, without any visible movement, she was suddenly at the passenger door. He still can't explain that part. He was watching the mirror. He never saw her walk those 20 feet. One moment she was back by the roadside, the next she was reaching for the door handle. The passenger door swung open and she climbed into the cab with fluid, effortless grace. Richard's first clear look at her face sent ice through his veins. She appeared to be in her early 20s with pale skin and dark hair that hung wet and straight despite the absence of any visible rain. Her eyes were the most disturbing part, completely empty, staring straight ahead without any acknowledgement of his presence. "Where are you headed?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady and casual. She didn't respond, didn't even turn her head. Just sat there, hands folded in her lap, staring through the windshield into the fog. "Miss, you okay? Where do you need to go?" Nothing. The silence in the cab had a physical weight to it, pressing down like the fog outside. Richard considered asking her to leave, but something, some instinct he couldn't name, kept him from doing so. Instead, he put the truck in gear and started driving, telling himself he'd take her to the next town, let her out at a gas station where there'd be other people. Light, warmth. The temperature inside the cab had plummeted. Richard could see his breath now, white clouds forming with each exhalation. That wasn't normal. The heater was running full blast, and the cab should have been uncomfortably warm. Instead, it felt like a meat locker, cold seeping into his bones with supernatural intensity. He glanced at his passenger. She hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. Water was dripping from her hair now, pooling on the seat beneath her. Though when Richard looked more closely, the liquid seemed darker than water, thicker somehow. "Miss, are you sure you're okay?" His voice came out as a whisper. For the first time, she turned her head, slowly, mechanically, like a mannequin on a swivel. Her eyes met his, and Richard felt his heart stop. They were wrong, completely, fundamentally wrong. Empty holes that seemed to bore straight through him, filled with a darkness that had nothing to do with the color of her irises and everything to do with the absence of anything human behind them. "Stop," she said. Just that one word, barely audible in a voice that sounded like wind through a graveyard. Richard's hands moved without conscious thought, his right hand reaching for the brake. He glanced at the road, then back at her. She was gone. The passenger seat was completely empty. No wet coat, no puddle of water, no depression in the cushion where she'd been sitting. The air in the cab was suddenly warm again, almost stifling, as if the heater had been working normally all along. Richard slammed on the brakes, the truck shuddering to a halt in the middle of the empty highway. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep them on the wheel. He stared at the empty seat, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Trying to find some rational explanation for a woman vanishing from a locked, moving vehicle. He checked the door. It was still locked from the inside, the same way he always kept it for security. She couldn't have opened it without him hearing, and even if she had, there was no way she could have jumped from a moving truck without him noticing. Richard sat there for nearly 20 minutes, engine idling, hazard lights flashing in, the fog, trying to convince himself he'd hallucinated the entire encounter. Lack of sleep, fatigue, carbon monoxide from a faulty exhaust. He grasped for any explanation that would let him continue believing the world worked the way he'd always thought it did. Finally, he put the truck in gear and drove the remaining 100 miles to Chicago in silence, radio off, windows down despite the cold, desperate for anything that felt real and normal. He didn't stop at truck stops, didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to put into words what he'd experienced because saying it out loud would make it real. Richard tried to forget the incident. He convinced himself he'd been tired, that his mind had played tricks, that there was a rational explanation he simply hadn't thought of yet. He continued his regular routes, including the Illinois stretch of Route 66, though he never picked up hitchhikers again. 3 weeks later, he stopped at Betty's Diner in Bloomington, a truck stop institution where drivers had been gathering for decades. The place was exactly what you'd expect: worn vinyl booths, a counter with red-topped stools, the smell of coffee and fried food, and a waitress who'd been working there since Eisenhower was president. Betty herself was behind the counter that afternoon, A woman in her 70s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every kind of trucker, drifter, and desperado the highway could produce. Richard had been eating there for years, and they'd developed the kind of casual friendship that comes from repeated encounters over time. "You look like you've seen a ghost, hun," Betty said, pouring his coffee without being asked. The comment hit too close to home. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the cup, and Betty noticed. She always noticed. "Richard, what's wrong?" He hadn't planned to tell anyone. The story sounded insane even in his own head. But something about Betty's matter-of-fact tone and steady gaze broke through his resistance. The words came tumbling out. The fog, the hitchhiker, the impossible cold. The way she'd vanished from a locked truck. Betty's expression never changed. She didn't laugh, didn't look skeptical, didn't suggest he was losing his mind. She just listened, occasionally nodding, her weathered hands wrapped around her own coffee cup. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached under the counter and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping, protected in a plastic sleeve. The paper was dated October 17, 1963, 15 years earlier. The headline read, "Local woman dies in highway accident." Below it was a photograph. Richard's hands went numb. It was her, the hitchhiker. Same face, same dark hair, same empty eyes staring out from the grainy newsprint. "Mary Catherine Reeves," Betty said quietly. 22 years old. Died right there on Route 66, about 5 miles west of here, when her car slid off the road in the fog. October 15, 1963, they found her 3 days later. Richard couldn't speak. The photograph blurred as his eyes refused to focus. "You're not the first," Betty continued. "Every few years, some trucker comes in here with the same story. Woman in a pale coat hitchhiking in the fog. Always the same stretch of highway. Always vanishes without a trace." She paused, sliding the clipping across the counter toward him. "And it always happens around the anniversary of her death. Mid-October, just like when you saw her." Richard left the diner with the clipping, though he never looked at it again. He kept driving Route 66 for another 12 years before retiring, but he never again drove that particular stretch at night, never again drove it in October, and never again picked up hitchhikers under any circumstances. Other drivers continued to report seeing her. A young woman in a pale coat, thumb out, standing at the roadside in the fog. Those who stop always experience the same thing, the impossible cold, the silence, the sudden vanishing. And when they inquire, they always learn about Mary Catherine Reeves, still trying to get home after all these years, still waiting for someone to give her that final ride she never completed. The fog remembers. The highway remembers. And somewhere along that desolate stretch of Route 66, Mary Catherine Reeves is still hitchhiking, still waiting, still vanishing into the cold October night, forever trapped between the road she died on and the home she never reached. Oregon Highway 97 runs like a spine through central Oregon, connecting California to Washington through some of the most beautiful and treacherous terrain in the Pacific Northwest. In winter, this route transforms into something primal and dangerous, a corridor of ice and snow where visibility can drop to 0 in seconds and the temperature can kill an unprepared traveler in under an hour. The stretch between Bend and the Washington border is particularly notorious. Here the highway cuts through dense pine forests that press close to the road, their branches heavy with snow, creating a claustrophobic tunnel effect even in daylight. At night, during a winter storm, this section of Highway 97 becomes a sensory deprivation chamber. Nothing exists beyond the weak cone of your headlights, and even that barely penetrates the wall of falling snow. James Corrigan knew this road intimately. As an independent trucker specializing in equipment, transport for timber operations, he'd driven Highway 97 in every season, every condition, every time of day and night. He'd navigated ice storms, whiteouts, and black ice patches that could send an 18-wheeler into a deadly skid. He was careful, experienced, and respected the road's capacity for violence. None of that prepared him for what he encountered in February 2011. The weather forecast had called for moderate snowfall, nothing unusual for mid-February in Central Oregon. But weather in the Cascades is notoriously unpredictable, and by the time James was 40 miles north of Bend, moderate snowfall had become a full-scale blizzard. Snow fell so thick it was like driving through television static. His windshield wipers, even at their maximum setting, could barely keep up. The road had disappeared beneath a uniform blanket of white, marked only by the reflective posts along the shoulder that blinked past like ghostly sentries. His speed had dropped to barely 30 miles per hour, and even that felt reckless. The cab of his Peterbilt was warm, the heater roaring against the sub-zero temperatures outside, the radio playing classic rock at low volume. James had another 2 hours of driving ahead of him, and he'd already decided this would be his last winter run on this route. At 48 years old, he was getting too old for this kind of stress, too aware of all the things that could go wrong. He was passing through a particularly dense section of forest, the trees creating walls of solid darkness on both sides when his headlights caught something that shouldn't be there. Lights approaching fast in his rearview mirror. At first, James felt relief. Another vehicle meant he wasn't alone on this godforsaken stretch of highway. Meant there'd be someone to call for help if he got into trouble. Meant another set of headlights to help mark the road's boundaries. But as the lights grew closer, that relief curdled into unease. The Sayosha vehicle, he could now see it was a pickup truck, judging by the height and spacing of the headlights, was approaching at a speed that was suicidal in these conditions. Easily 60 or 70 miles per hour, maybe faster, weaving slightly but maintaining a trajectory that would bring it right up behind James's truck in seconds. "Idiot's going to get himself killed," James muttered, easing his truck toward the right shoulder to give the pickup room to pass. In weather like this, the last thing you wanted was some reckless driver riding your bumper or trying to overtake in limited visibility. But the pickup didn't pass. It pulled up behind James's trailer and matched his speed exactly, maintaining a distance of maybe 20 feet. Far too close for safe following distance in these conditions, close enough that its headlights blazed in James's mirrors like twin searchlights. James slowed down, hoping the pickup would go around him. It slowed too, maintaining that exact 20-foot distance. He could see it clearly now in his mirrors. An older model Ford F-150, dark-colored, though the snow and darkness made it hard to determine the exact shade. The truck looked solid, real, its headlights cutting through the snow with almost unnatural intensity. But something was wrong. James's practiced ear, honed by decades of listening to engine sounds, couldn't hear the pickup's motor. With his window cracked for ventilation, he should have been able to hear it over the sound of his own diesel engine. But there was nothing. Just the howl of wind, the hiss of falling snow, and the rumble of his own Peterbilt. "Come on, buddy," James said to himself. "Either pass me or back off." As if responding to his words, the pickup suddenly accelerated, pulling into the left lane. Relief washed over James. Finally, the lunatic was going to pass and leave him alone. He maintained his speed, watching the truck draw alongside his cab. That's when he got his first good look at the driver's side of the pickup, illuminated by his own headlights and the glow from his cab, and felt his blood turn to ice. There was no one behind the wheel. The driver's seat was empty, completely, unmistakably empty. And stranger still, the truck cast no shadow on the snow, left no tracks in the fresh powder, made no sound at all. It was there, solid and real, but simultaneously wrong in ways that violated every law of physics. James's hands clenched the steering wheel as the pickup drew even with his cab window. He turned his head to look directly at it, close enough now that he could see details. The dents in the fender, rust around the wheel wells, a cracked taillight. But still no driver. Still no tracks. Still no sound. The pickup hung there beside him for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 or 6 seconds. Then, without any change in speed or direction, it simply vanished. One moment it was there, solid and real, headlights blazing through the storm. The next moment it was gone, as if someone had flipped a switch and turned off its existence. James's training took over. He didn't panic, didn't swerve, didn't slam on the brakes, all of which could have sent his truck into a lethal skid on the ice-covered highway. Instead, he carefully slowed down, pulling onto the shoulder when he found a safe place to stop. Hazard lights flashing in the storm. His hands were shaking as he put the truck in park. He sat there for several minutes, engine running, trying to process what he'd seen, or what he thought he'd seen. The logical part of his brain cycled through explanations. Hallucination, fatigue, snow blindness causing optical illusions. The weird way light and shadow can play tricks in limited visibility. But he'd seen it. He'd seen the rust, the cracked taillight, the empty driver's seat. He'd watched it appear, watched it pace him, watched it vanish without leaving tracks in the fresh snow. He pulled out his phone to call the state patrol to warn them about a dangerous driver or a vehicle in distress, but he had no signal. Not unusual in this remote stretch, but frustrating. He considered turning around, heading back to Bend, but the thought of driving back through that same stretch of highway where the phantom pickup had appeared filled him with a dread he couldn't rationalize. So he sat there, hazard lights blinking, snow accumulating on his windshield, trying to decide what to do. Eventually, he started driving again, making it to his destination 3 hours later without further incident. He didn't mention the encounter to the equipment yard workers when he arrived. Didn't mention it to his wife when he called home. Didn't mention it to anyone for nearly a week. What finally broke James's silence was another news story. This one about a fatal accident on Highway 97, just 5 miles south of where he'd seen the phantom pickup. A delivery van had lost control in snowy conditions and slid off the road, killing the driver instantly. The accident had occurred less than an hour after James had cleared that section of highway. The coincidence gnawed at him. He'd seen something impossible, and shortly afterwards someone had died on the same stretch of road. He began searching online, looking for similar reports, anything that might explain what he'd experienced. What he found was disturbing. Highway 97 had a long history of accident reports that included mentions of mysterious vehicles. Multiple drivers over the years had reported seeing trucks or cars that appeared out of nowhere, often right before accidents occurred. The descriptions varied, but certain details remained consistent. Vehicles that made no sound, left no tracks, and vanished without explanation. James found an online forum for truckers and, using an anonymous handle, posted his own experience. The responses came quickly. Dozens of drivers reported similar encounters on Highway 97. One described it almost exactly as James had experienced, a pickup truck approaching at high speed, pulling alongside, then vanishing. Another spoke of a sedan that had paced them for miles before disappearing into thin air. A third reported seeing a logging truck that phased through their vehicle like it wasn't even there. One response from a retired Oregon State Trooper was particularly chilling. "We've been getting reports of the phantom truck on Highway 97 for at least 30 years that I know of, probably longer. Nobody in the department talks about it officially, but we all know the pattern. Vehicle appears in bad weather, particularly heavy snow. Usually near the sites of previous fatal accidents. Often shows up right before new accidents occur. We've had officers respond to calls about dangerous drivers matching these descriptions, and we never find anything. No tracks, no vehicle, nothing, just fresh snow that's never, been disturbed. The trooper's post continued. Off the record, most of us who work this highway believe it's some kind of warning. The phantom truck appears before bad accidents. If you see it, you should get off the highway immediately. Find a place to stop and wait out the weather. Don't keep driving. The folks who ignore it, well, not all of them make it to their destination. What troubled James most, and what he initially didn't include in his forum post, was what happened after the phantom pickup vanished. In that moment of shock and confusion as he was processing what he'd seen, he'd looked to his right, into the dark forest that pressed close to the highway. Something was looking back. He couldn't see details. The darkness and falling snow made that impossible. But he had an overwhelming sense of being observed by multiple presences standing just inside the tree line, watching the highway with patient, malevolent attention. He'd felt their gaze, like a physical weight, felt them studying him, measuring him, deciding something about him. The sensation had lasted only a few seconds before he'd forced his attention back to the road and accelerated away. But even now, weeks later, he could recall that feeling of being scrutinized by something ancient and hostile, something that lived in the spaces between the trees and studied the vehicles that passed through its territory. Other drivers who'd seen the phantom pickup reported similar sensations. A feeling of being watched from the forest, an impression of shapes moving between the trees, keeping pace with their vehicles. One driver described stopping to investigate and hearing what sounded like footsteps circling his truck in the darkness, though no tracks were visible in the snow the next morning. James Corrigan sold his truck 6 months after his encounter and took a job doing local deliveries in the Portland metro area. He hasn't driven Highway 97 since that February night, and he has no intention of ever doing so again. The memory of that empty pickup truck and the things watching from the forest haunts him in a way nothing else in his long driving career ever has. The James W. Dalton Highway is not a road you take by accident. Running 414 miles from Fairbanks north to the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay, it is one of the most remote, dangerous, and unforgiving roads in North America. For most of its length, the Dalton Highway is nothing more than a gravel track carved through absolute wilderness, a supply corridor for Alaska's oil industry that sees more caribou than cars. This is a road where help is measured in hours, not minutes, where cell phone coverage is a fantasy and the nearest town is often 100 miles away, where winter temperatures routinely plunge to 50 below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, cold enough to kill an unprepared traveler in under an hour, where during the heart of winter the sun barely rises, leaving the highway in perpetual Arctic twilight that can disorient even experienced drivers. The Dalton Highway has claimed lives, dozens of them. Accidents, exposure, vehicle breakdowns that turned fatal. The road has its own body count, and it continues to grow. Those who drive it regularly, the supply truckers who haul equipment and materials to the northern oil fields, speak of it with a mixture of respect and superstition. They know the road's moods, its dangers, its tricks, and they know its ghosts. Mark Davidson learned about those ghosts in January 2016 on a supply run that should have been routine and became anything but. Mark had been driving the Dalton Highway for 6 years, employed by a logistics company that serviced the Prudhoe Bay oil fields. He specialized in winter runs, the most dangerous, highest-paying hauls when the road was at its most treacherous and most necessary. Summer on the Dalton brought tourists in rental RVs, adventurers looking for bragging rights, filmmakers documenting the road's mystique. But winter belonged to the professionals, to the men and women who understood that the Dalton Highway in January was a test of competence, equipment, and will. This particular run had started normally enough. Mark had left Fairbanks at 2 p.m., planning to reach Coldfoot by early evening, then push on through the night to reach Deadhorse and the oil fields beyond by late morning. His Kenworth W900 was loaded with drilling equipment, winterized and prepared for the extreme conditions ahead. He carried survival gear rated for 70 below zero, enough food for a week, spare fuel, emergency communications equipment and weapons, a rifle for deterring curious bears, and a handgun for emergencies he preferred not to think about. By the time he passed Coldfoot, the last outpost of civilization on the route, full darkness had fallen. This far north in mid-January, night was a relative term. The sun barely rose above the horizon during the brief afternoon, casting long shadows and dim twilight before surrendering to darkness that would last nearly 20 hours. Mark was 80 miles north of Coldfoot, approaching the Brooks Range when he first noticed the lights behind him. At first, he thought it was another trucker, perhaps someone who'd left Coldfoot shortly after him, now catching up on the desolate highway. But as the lights drew closer, Mark realized it wasn't one vehicle. It was several. A whole convoy of trucks, their headlights stretching back into the darkness like a string of stars. Relief flooded through him. The Dalton Highway was dangerous enough in winter, but having company, having other professionals on the road with you made it marginally less terrifying. There was safety in numbers, even if that safety was mostly psychological. But as the convoy drew closer, that relief began to curdle into something else. Something wrong. The trucks were perfectly aligned, maintaining exact spacing between each vehicle. Their headlights were uniform, identical in intensity and color. And they were moving fast, far too fast for the conditions, for the darkness, for the gravel road covered in patches of ice that could send a vehicle careening into the tundra. Mark slowed down, pulling to the right to let them pass. The Dalton Highway was wide enough for passing in most places, and it was standard protocol to give faster traffic room. He expected to see the convoy blow past him in a cloud of gravel and diesel exhaust. Instead, they matched his speed. He slowed further. They slowed with him. He could see them clearly now in his mirrors, a line of heavy-duty trucks, all identical makes and models, all painted the same dark color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There must have been 7 or 8 of them, though the darkness made it hard to count accurately. And they made no sound. That's what finally triggered Mark's alarm, what elevated his unease into genuine fear. At this distance, on this empty highway, he should have been able to hear their engines, even over the sound of his own, Kenworth. Diesel engines at highway speed create a distinctive roar, a mechanical thunder that carries for miles in the Arctic silence. These trucks were completely, impossibly silent. Mark accelerated, pushing his truck up to 60 miles per hour, faster than was safe, but he suddenly wanted distance between himself and whatever was following him. The convoy accelerated with him, maintaining that perfect formation, that exact spacing, that eerie silence. He grabbed his CB radio. "Breaker, breaker, this is Ice Road 79er, anyone copy?" Static. "Any truckers heading north on the Dalton? This is Mark Davidson, got a convoy behind me, need identification, over." More static. The radio was working. He could hear the hiss and crackle of empty channels, but no one was responding. Mark's hands were sweating despite the cold. He glanced in his mirrors again, and his heart nearly stopped. The trucks behind him weren't touching the road. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as a trick of the light or the way headlights can create optical illusions in darkness. But the more Mark stared, the more certain he became. The trucks weren't quite touching the gravel surface. They hovered inches above it, creating no dust clouds, leaving no tire tracks in the patches of snow that covered sections of the highway. And now that he was looking more carefully, he could see through them. Not completely, they weren't transparent like ghosts in movies, but there was a translucency to them, a quality of unreality that made them seem more like projections than physical objects. "Jesus Christ," Mark whispered. His theological education was limited, but in that moment prayer seemed like the only appropriate response. The convoy began to pull alongside him, the lead truck drawing even with his cab. Mark forced himself to look to see what was driving these impossible vehicles. The cab was empty. All of them were empty, no drivers, no passengers. No living thing controlling these massive machines as they hurtled through the Arctic night at impossible speeds without making a sound. Mark felt his bladder threaten to let go. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. He'd been on the Dalton Highway for 6 years, had seen mirages caused by Arctic light, had experienced the disorientation of 20-hour darkness, had dealt with the psychological stress of isolation. But this was something else entirely. This was impossible, and yet it was happening right now, right beside him. The ghostly convoy hung there for what might have been 30 seconds or might have been 5 minutes. Mark's sense of time had completely disintegrated. Then, as suddenly and silently as they had appeared, the trucks began to fade. Not drive away, not accelerate into the distance. Fade, becoming more and more transparent until they were just suggestions of light and shadow. And then nothing at all. Gone. Completely gone. As if they had never existed. Mark pulled over immediately, hands shaking so badly he could barely control the steering wheel. He sat there in the middle of the Dalton Highway, engine idling, hazard lights flashing, trying to remember how to breathe. He'd seen something impossible, he knew that. But the alternative, that he was losing his mind, that the isolation and darkness were causing him to hallucinate, was almost more terrifying than believing in ghost trucks. After 10 minutes, he forced himself to start driving again. He had a job to do, a delivery to make, and sitting on the side of the highway in 70 below zero weather was a good way to die if his truck developed problems. He drove slowly, carefully, eyes constantly checking his mirrors for any sign of the phantom convoy. It took him another 6 hours to reach Dead Horse, the longest 6 hours of his life. When he finally pulled into the facility at Prudhoe Bay, the first light of dawn was breaking over the Arctic horizon, a pale, weak illumination that nonetheless felt like salvation after the endless night. Mark didn't mention the convoy to anyone at first. He delivered his load, filed his paperwork, grabbed a meal and 6 hours of sleep in the driver's quarters and prepared for the return trip. But the encounter gnawed at him, refusing to be rationalized or dismissed. On his second night at Prudhoe Bay, he was having dinner in the facility cafeteria when he overheard 2 other truckers talking in low voices. One of them, an older driver named Carl, was describing seeing something on the Dalton Highway, a convoy of trucks that appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as mysteriously. Mark's fork clattered onto his tray. Both men turned to look at him. "You've seen them too," Carl said. It wasn't a question. Mark nodded slowly. 2 nights ago, about 80 miles north of Coldfoot. Carl exchanged a look with the other trucker, then gestured for Mark to join them. Over the next hour, as the cafeteria gradually emptied, they shared stories. Carl had seen the phantom convoy 3 times over his 15 years on the Dalton Highway. The other driver, whose name was Tom, had seen them twice. Both men described identical experiences. The perfect formation, the silence, the way the trucks didn't quite touch the road, the empty cabs, the sudden vanishing. "Started seeing them in the late 90s, Carl said. "Right after that big accident, you remember?" Tom nodded grimly. "The February convoy." Mark shook his head. "What accident?" Carl pulled out his phone and after several minutes of searching through spotty internet coverage, found what he was looking for. A news article from February 1997. "Convoy of 7 supply trucks heading north," Carl read aloud. "Blizzard conditions, 0 visibility. The lead truck missed a curve, went off the road. The trucks behind him, they couldn't stop in time, couldn't even see what happened. All 7 trucks went over the embankment. All 7 drivers killed instantly. They say it took 3 days to recover all the bodies. Mark felt cold settle into his bones that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature. "Where did it happen?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "About 80 miles north of Coldfoot," Tom said quietly. "Same stretch where you saw them." Over the following weeks, Mark began researching the phenomenon, talking to other drivers, piecing together a pattern. The Phantom convoy appeared primarily to drivers traveling alone, usually between midnight and 4 a.m., always on the same stretch of highway where the 1997 accident had occurred. Some drivers reported seeing the convoy only once. Others, like Carl, had seen them multiple times. But there was another pattern, one more disturbing. Drivers who saw the Phantom convoy often reported that something felt wrong in the moments before the trucks appeared. An oppressive silence that was deeper than the normal Arctic quiet. A sense of being watched, a feeling of presence in the darkness. And more disturbingly, several drivers reported experiencing mechanical failures shortly after the convoy vanished. Electrical problems, brake malfunctions, steering issues, minor problems that could have become fatal if they'd occurred at the wrong moment. One driver, speaking anonymously, claimed the Phantom convoy had saved his life. He'd seen them appear ahead of him on the road, and something about their presence had made him slow down dramatically. Moments later, he hit a patch of black ice that would have sent him off the road at his previous speed. Instead, he was able to maintain control. "It's like they're trying to warn us," the driver had said. "Like they're still out there, still trying to do their jobs, still trying to help." Mark made the return trip to Fairbanks without incident, but he never forgot the Phantom convoy, and he never drove that stretch of highway without watching his mirrors, without listening to the silence, without wondering if tonight would be the night they appeared again. He saw them one more time 3 months later under similar conditions. Deep night, clear weather, absolute isolation. This time he was more prepared, less terrified. He watched them appear, pace him for several miles, and vanish back into the darkness. And afterward, when he stopped to check his truck, he found that one of his brake lines had developed a slow leak. Not enough to cause immediate failure, but enough that it would have become critical by the time he reached Fairbanks if he hadn't discovered it. He had the brake line repaired at Coldfoot. The mechanic who did the work listened to his story with a knowing expression. "They're looking out for you," the mechanic said. "The convoy. A lot of us up here believe they're still running their route, still checking on the living drivers, still trying to make sure nobody else joins them." Mark wanted to dismiss it as superstition, as the kind of folklore that develops around dangerous places. But he'd seen them, twice, and both times something about the encounter had made him more careful, more aware, had potentially saved his life. He continued driving the Dalton Highway for another 2 years before taking a job on more southern routes. The pay was less, but he told himself he was ready for warmer weather, for roads where the sun actually rose every day, for places where help was measured in minutes instead of hours. But the real reason was the convoy. Not because he was afraid of them. He'd come to believe they were benign, possibly even protective. But because every time he drove that stretch of highway, every time he entered that zone of darkness and silence where 7 men had died in an instant, he felt them watching. Felt their presence in the empty miles, in the Arctic night, in the spaces between heartbeats, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someday the Phantom convoy wouldn't vanish. Someday they'd slow down, and there'd be room for one more truck in their formation, and he'd find himself joining a journey that never ended, driving forever through the Arctic darkness on a road with no destination. The Dalton Highway remembers its dead, and according to those who drive it, the dead remember the road. Highway 35, Washington. Highway 35 winds through the Mount Hood National Forest in northern Oregon and southern Washington like a ribbon of asphalt through an ocean of green. During the day, it's beautiful, a scenic route through old-growth forest past mountain vistas alongside crystal-clear streams. But at night, particularly in summer when the dense foliage creates an impenetrable wall of darkness on both sides, Highway 35 becomes something else entirely. The road is narrow, 2 lanes with minimal shoulder, twisting and turning through terrain that offers no escape and no visibility beyond the next curve. Cell phone coverage is sporadic at best. There are long stretches where you might not see another vehicle for an hour or more, and according to locals, there are sections of Highway 35 where you might encounter something that isn't quite a vehicle at all. Karen Mitchell found this out in July 2014, during what should have been a peaceful summer evening drive home from Portland. Karen was a registered nurse at Oregon Health and Science University, working the day shift that left her commuting home in the early evening. The drive from Portland to her home near Hood River normally took about 90 minutes, most of it along scenic highways that she'd driven hundreds of times. On this particular evening, she'd left work around 7 p.m., hoping to beat the worst of the traffic. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, warm but not hot, with the long summer twilight that makes Pacific Northwest evenings so beautiful. She'd made it through the urban sprawl of Portland and Gresham without incident, and by the time she turned onto Highway 35 heading east toward Hood River, she was starting to relax, windows down, radio playing softly, enjoying the drive. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the forest, when she first noticed the car behind her. It appeared in her rearview mirror suddenly, as if it had materialized out of the shadows rather than driving up normally. Karen didn't think much of it at first. Other drivers used this route, and it wasn't unusual to have company on the highway. She glanced at the speedometer, confirmed she was doing the speed limit, and returned her attention to the road. The car stayed behind her, perfectly positioned, centered in its lane, maintaining an exact distance of maybe 40 feet. Karen couldn't see the driver clearly. The angle was wrong and the setting sun created glare in her mirrors. But she could see the vehicle was a mid-sized sedan, dark-colored with headlights that seemed unusually bright for the time of day. After several miles, Karen began to feel uneasy. The car hadn't attempted to pass, hadn't fallen back, hadn't varied its distance at all. When she slowed down for curves, it slowed. When she accelerated on straightaways, it accelerated. The precision was unnerving, like the car was locked onto her bumper by an invisible tether. Karen decided to test her suspicion. On a straight section of road with good visibility, she accelerated, pushing her Honda Civic up to 55, then 60 miles per hour. Faster than was probably wise on this winding road, but not recklessly fast. The car behind her matched her speed exactly, never gaining, never falling back. Karen's unease was rapidly becoming fear. There was something fundamentally wrong about the way the car was following her. No normal driver maintained such perfect distance, such exact speed matching. It felt predatory, like being tracked by something that was studying her movements, learning her patterns. She tried slowing down, dropping to 30 miles per hour, hoping the car would get impatient and pass. It slowed with her, maintaining that exact 40-foot distance. The sun had fully set now, and the forest on both sides of Highway 35 had become walls of absolute darkness broken only by her headlights. The car behind her had turned on its headlights as well, those unusually bright lights that now flooded her interior, making it difficult to see anything except the glare in her mirrors. Karen's hands were sweating on the steering wheel. She considered calling the police, but what would she say? A car is following me? Following me legally, in its own lane, obeying traffic laws? They'd think she was paranoid or hysterical. But this wasn't normal. Every instinct, every primitive alarm system in her brain was screaming that something was wrong, that she was in danger, that she needed to get away from whatever was behind her. She accelerated again, this time pushing her Civic to its limits on the winding forest highway. 70 miles per hour. 75. The engine whined in protest and her tires squealed slightly on the tighter curves. Her rational mind knew this was dangerous, that she was risking her life driving at this speed on this road. But her rational mind had been overridden by pure survival instinct. The car stayed with her, effortlessly, as if speed meant nothing to it, as if physics didn't apply, as if it could match any velocity she attempted. Karen knew there was a gas station about 10 miles ahead, a small place that served the sparse local population and passing travelers. If she could make it there, if there were other people around, maybe the car would leave her alone. Maybe she could call for help. Maybe she'd find out this was all some bizarre misunderstanding. Those 10 miles were the longest of her life. She drove as fast as she dared, hands aching from gripping the wheel, eyes burning from the glare of those relentless headlights, her entire body rigid with tension. The car never wavered, never varied, never showed any sign of human behavior. No drift to the side, no slight speed variations, nothing that indicated a living person was controlling it. The gas station appeared ahead, its lights like a beacon of civilization in the dark forest. Karen didn't signal, didn't slow down gradually. She hit the brakes hard and cranked the wheel, skidding into the parking lot with a screech of tires that echoed through the empty night. She threw her car into park and looked in her rearview mirror, expecting to see the pursuing vehicle pull in behind her, expecting to finally see who had been following her. The highway was empty, completely empty. No car, no headlights, no sound of an engine. Just the dark asphalt of Highway 35 stretching away into the forest, illuminated by the gas station's lights for maybe 50 feet before disappearing into absolute darkness. Karen sat there, engine idling, hands still gripping the wheel, trying to process what had just happened. The car couldn't have passed her. There'd been no time and she would have seen it. It couldn't have turned around. There'd been no place to turn around for miles and she would have seen the headlights. It had simply vanished, as if it had never existed at all. Her hands were shaking as she turned off her engine and stepped out of the car. The gas station was a mom-and-pop operation, the kind that somehow survives in remote locations through sheer stubbornness. The fluorescent lights inside seemed painfully bright after the darkness of the highway. The clerk, a man in his 60s with a weathered face and tired eyes, looked up as Karen entered. His expression changed immediately from bored routine to concern. "You okay, miss?" Karen realized she must look as terrified as she felt. There was a car following me, on the highway, following me really close for miles, but when I pulled in here, it just disappeared." The clerk's expression shifted from concern to something else, recognition maybe, or resignation. He nodded slowly. "Dark sedan? Headlights really bright?" Karen felt her scalp prickle. "Yes. How did you—" "You're not the first," the clerk said simply. "Won't be the last, I expect." He poured a cup of coffee from the pot behind the counter and pushed it toward her. "Sit down. You're safe here. It never comes off the highway." Over the next 30 minutes, as Karen drank terrible coffee and tried to stop shaking, the clerk told her what he knew. The phenomenon had been reported for at least 20 years, probably longer. Drivers on Highway 35, usually traveling alone, usually at night or twilight, would find themselves followed by a dark sedan that matched their every move with inhuman precision. The car would pursue them for miles, sometimes staying behind, sometimes pulling alongside, but always maintaining that eerie, perfect formation. And then, When the pursued driver found a place to stop, a gas station, a turnout with other vehicles, any place with people and light, the pursuing car would simply vanish. No one had ever seen it turn around, drive away, or park. It was there, and then it wasn't. Folks call it the silent driver, the clerk said, because nobody's ever seen anyone behind the wheel, nobody's ever heard an engine, and nobody's ever gotten a license plate. It's like there isn't one, or it's too dark to see, or something. But what is it? Karen asked. Some kind of prank? Some asshole with a self-driving car? The clerk shook his head. Been happening since the 90s, long before self-driving cars, and whatever it is, it ain't natural. I've had folks come in here nearly hysterical, swearing they watched the thing drive right through a fallen tree that was blocking half the road. Drive through it like it was a ghost. Others say when it pulls alongside them, they can see there's nobody driving, and the interior of the car is wrong, empty in a way that ain't natural. Has anyone been hurt? Karen asked. Not directly, the clerk said. Not that I know of, but folks who see it, they're shaken up pretty bad, and he hesitated. There have been some accidents, people so scared they lose control of their vehicles. Couple of fatalities over the years. Can't prove the silent driver was involved, but the drivers who survived, before the accidents, they all reported being followed by a car that wouldn't let them alone. Karen finished her coffee and prepared to leave. The clerk walked her to her car, looking up and down the dark highway with an expression of habitual wariness. You be careful, he said. Usually once it's followed someone, it leaves them alone after that, but not always. If you see it again, find a place with people and lights. Don't try to outrun it, you can't. And whatever you do, don't stop on the highway itself, don't get out of your car on the road. Because the folks who've done that, well, they describe things standing at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting for someone to make that mistake. Karen's remaining drive home was tense, her eyes constantly checking mirrors, her foot ready to accelerate at the first sign of headlights. But the highway remained empty. She made it home without incident, parked in her garage, and sat there for several minutes before she felt steady enough to go inside. She never saw the silent driver again. But for months afterward, any time she drove Highway 35 at night, she felt watched. Felt something keeping pace with her just beyond the reach of her headlights. Something that lived in the dark spaces between trees. Something that used a phantom car to hunt and study the travelers who dared to drive its highway. Karen eventually connected with other witnesses through online forums dedicated to paranormal highway phenomena. She found dozens of accounts nearly identical to her own: the dark sedan, the perfect tracking, the sudden vanishing when the pursued driver found refuge among people and light. One theory, proposed by a retired police officer who'd investigated several accidents, possibly connected to the silent driver, suggested it was connected to an unsolved case from 1991. A woman had disappeared while driving Highway 35 alone at night. Her car was found abandoned at a scenic turnout, engine still running, driver's door open, no signs of struggle. She was never seen again. Witnesses from the night of her disappearance reported seeing a dark sedan following her car shortly before she vanished. Police investigated but found nothing. No suspect vehicle, no evidence of foul play, no leads. The case went cold. The first reports of the silent driver began appearing about a year after the woman's disappearance. The theory suggested that the phantom car was somehow connected to whatever had taken her, that it was still hunting. Still pursuing solitary drivers on the same highway where it had successfully claimed at least one victim. Karen doesn't know if she believes that theory. But she knows what she experienced, knows that something impossible followed her through the dark forest, knows that when she should have been safe, alone on an empty highway, she was being hunted by something that wore the shape of a car, but was fundamentally something else. She still drives Highway 35 sometimes, It's the most direct route between Portland and her home. But never alone, never at night. And always with her phone charged, her tank full, and her eyes constantly checking the mirrors for headlights that match her speed too perfectly. That shine too bright, that belong to a car with no driver and no sound and no mercy for those who find themselves in its sights. The silent driver is still out there, still hunting, still waiting for that one driver who makes the mistake of stopping, of getting out of their car, of stepping into the darkness where the things at the forest's edge can finally reach them. The A75 between Dumfries and Stranraer in southwestern Scotland has been called the most haunted road in Britain, a stretch of asphalt with a reputation so dark that even locals avoid driving it at night unless absolutely necessary. The road cuts through remote countryside, past ancient forests and barren moors, through towns whose names speak of centuries of human habitation on land far older than any human settlement. This is a landscape soaked in history and blood, ancient battles, medieval witchcraft trials, unexplained disappearances. The Celts believed the area was a thin place, where the barrier between the mortal world and the other world was fragile, where things could slip through from one reality to another. The Romans, when they occupied Britain, reported strange encounters along the old roads through this region, sightings of phantom armies, encounters with creatures that defied explanation. The modern A75 follows routes that have been traveled for thousands of years. And according to hundreds of witnesses over the past several decades, something shares that road with the living. Something that takes the form of a red hatchback and repeats its journey endlessly, following travelers with an obsession that transcends death. Derek and Louise Campbell were driving home to Stranraer after visiting family in Dumfries on a cold November evening in 2003. The drive normally took about an hour, and they'd made it dozens of times without incident. This night would be different. They'd been on the A75 for about 20 minutes, driving through a particularly desolate stretch of moorland, when Derek noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. The lights appeared suddenly, as if the vehicle had just crested a hill, though Derek couldn't recall passing any hills significant enough to block his view. "Someone in a hurry," Louise commented, noticing the lights as well. The car, they could now see, It was a small red hatchback, possibly a Ford Fiesta, caught up to them quickly and settled into position about 30 feet behind their Volvo. Derek was driving slightly over the speed limit, and he found it mildly annoying that the hatchback had caught up but wasn't attempting to pass. "Pass me already," Derek muttered. But the hatchback didn't pass. It stayed there, maintaining exact distance, matching Derek's speed. After several miles, Derek deliberately slowed down, expecting the hatchback to go around. It slowed with him. "That's odd," Louise said. Derek accelerated. The hatchback accelerated. The precision was unnerving. No matter what speed Derek chose, the red hatchback matched it exactly, never gaining, never falling back. "Maybe they're following us," Louise said, her tone trying for joking but landing somewhere closer to worried. "Why would anyone follow us?" Derek said, but he was wondering the same thing. They were ordinary people, a school teacher and a postal worker, living an ordinary life in a small Scottish town. Nobody had any reason to follow them. The A75 is a winding road in this section, with numerous turns and elevation changes. Derek used these to his advantage, accelerating on straightaways and slowing for curves, trying to create variations that the hatchback couldn't match. But it stayed with them, as if connected by an invisible cable, its headlights a constant presence in the Volvo's mirrors. "Derek, I don't like this," Louise said. "Neither do I," Derek admitted. He pulled out his mobile phone, checked the signal, 2 bars, enough to make a call if necessary. But call whom? The police? To report what exactly? A car is driving behind me legally? They drove for another 10 miles, the red hatchback maintaining its vigil. Derek was considering pulling into the next town, looking for a police station or at least a public place with other people, when Louise gasped. "Derek, look!" He glanced at the rearview mirror and felt his stomach drop. The red hatchback was gone. The road behind them was empty, illuminated by their taillights and the faint glow of the moon. No headlights, no car, nothing. "Where did it—" Derek began. "There!" Louise pointed ahead. Derek's eyes snapped to the road in front of them. The red hatchback was there, about 100 yards ahead, driving in the same direction they were. Its taillights glowed in the darkness like red eyes. "That's impossible," Derek whispered. "There's no way it could have passed us. We would have seen it. We would have heard it." But there it was, undeniably ahead of them when seconds earlier it had been behind. Derek slowed down instinctively, not wanting to catch up to it, not wanting to get any closer to whatever impossible thing was sharing the road with them. The hatchback slowed too, maintaining distance. Over the next 40 minutes, as they drove the remaining distance to Stranraer, the red hatchback appeared and disappeared multiple times. Sometimes it was behind them, sometimes ahead. Once, impossibly, Louise saw it on a parallel road visible through a gap in the trees, matching their speed on a road that should have been miles away. Each appearance was the same, the red hatchback, always at the same distance, always matching their speed, always vanishing and reappearing without any rational explanation for how it could move from one position to another. Derek tried everything. He pulled over once, and the hatchback vanished immediately. When he resumed driving, it reappeared in his mirror minutes later. He took a detour through a small village, adding miles to their journey, and the hatchback followed, always there, always watching, always repeating its impossible journey. By the time they reached their home in Stranraer, both Derek and Louise were exhausted from fear and confusion. They pulled into their driveway, and Derek immediately looked back at the street. The red hatchback was there, parked at the curb about 50 feet away. Its lights were off. In the streetlight's glow, Derek could see the car was empty, completely empty. No driver, no passengers, no signs of life. Just a red hatchback sitting in the darkness facing their house. "Should we call the police?" Louise asked, her voice shaking. Derek considered it. "And tell them what? There's an empty car on our street?" They watched the hatchback for several minutes. It didn't move. No one appeared. Finally, Derek decided to approach it, to look for a license plate, to find any identifying information that might explain what was happening. He made it halfway across his lawn when the hatchback's lights came on, just the headlights, bright and sudden in the darkness. Derek froze. The car sat there, illuminated from within by those lights, still empty, still motionless. Then it simply faded, not drove away, faded, became more faded, and more transparent until it was just a suggestion of a shape, and then nothing at all. Derek stood in his lawn, staring at the empty curb where the hatchback had been, trying to understand what he'd witnessed. He couldn't. The world he thought he understood, the rational universe of cause and effect, had just revealed itself to be far stranger and more terrifying than he'd imagined. The Campbells reported their experience to the local police, expecting to be dismissed or mocked. Instead, the officer who took their statement nodded with weary recognition. "Red hatchback on the A75, the officer asked. "You're not the first to report it, won't be the last." The officer, a sergeant named McDonald, who'd worked in the area for 20 years, shared what he knew. The red hatchback had been seen by dozens of drivers over the years, possibly longer. The reports were remarkably consistent. A red hatchback that followed drivers, that appeared and disappeared without explanation, that maintained perfect distance no matter the pursued driver's speed. That seemed to be able to jump from one position to another on the road. "We've investigated every report," McDonald said. "Checked for pranks, for stalkers, for any conventional explanation. Found nothing. There's no actual red hatchback that matches the descriptions. The car people describe, it's like no specific make or model, it's just a red hatchback. Generic. Like something's idea of what a car should look like rather than an actual car. He pulled out a folder thick with reports dating back to the 1980s. Different witnesses, different dates, but the same story. The highway repeater, as some called it, followed travelers on the A75, particularly at night, particularly on certain stretches of road known for other paranormal activity. "Has anyone been hurt?" Derek asked. "Not directly," McDonald said. "But we've had a few accidents where drivers reported being followed by the red hatchback before they crashed. They claim it distracted them, terrified them, caused them to lose control. Can't prove it, of course. And we've had reports of people stopping to confront the driver, only to find the car empty. Some of them describe a feeling of intense dread when they approach the hatchback, like there's something wrong with the space around it." Derek Campbell became obsessed with understanding what he'd encountered. He began researching the A75's history, talking to locals, collecting stories that had been passed down through generations. What he found was disturbing. The A75 follows the route of an ancient Roman road, which itself followed Celtic paths even older. For centuries, possibly millennia, travelers on this route had reported strange encounters. Medieval records mentioned phantom travelers, spectral coaches, and mysterious lights that followed night travelers. In the 1950s, before the modern A75 was built, drivers on the older road reported being followed by a black car that would vanish when approached. In the 1970s, the reports changed. Now it was a red car, matching the style of vehicles popular in that era. Derek found a news clipping from 1984 about a fatal accident on the A75. A young woman had died when her red Ford Fiesta left the road and struck a tree. The article mentioned that witnesses had reported seeing her driving erratically before the crash, as if trying to escape from something, though no other vehicles were involved. The description of her car matched the red hatchback that had followed Derek and Louise. Same make, same color, same era. Derek visited the crash site, marked now only by a weathered memorial stone barely visible from the road. The location was in one of the sections where the highway repeater was most frequently seen. Local paranormal researchers had various theories about the highway repeater. Some believed it was the ghost of the young woman who died in 1984, endlessly repeating her final journey, following other drivers the way something might have followed her before she crashed. Others suggested something darker, that the A75 passed through an area with unusual properties where time didn't flow normally, where the past and present overlapped. In this theory, the red hatchback wasn't a ghost but an echo, a moment of time repeating itself, visible to travelers who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong moment. A few researchers believed the hatchback was something predatory, a lure or trap created by some intelligence that fed on fear and confusion. This theory pointed to reports of people who'd stopped to investigate the hatchback and experienced missing time, arriving at their destinations hours later than they should have, with no memory of the intervening time. Derek didn't know what to believe. He only knew that he and Louise had experienced something impossible, and that whatever the red hatchback was, it was still out there, still following travelers on the A75, still repeating its endless journey through the night. In the years since their encounter, Derek has collected dozens of similar accounts. A pattern emerged. The red hatchback appears most frequently on Thursday and Saturday nights, between 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. It targets solitary drivers or couples, rarely vehicles with multiple passengers. It prefers certain stretches of the A75, particularly near Drumlin Rig, Crocketford, and Glenluce, areas with histories of paranormal activity. The hatchback can follow a vehicle for miles or only minutes before vanishing. Some witnesses report seeing it only once. Others, like Derek and Louise, experience multiple appearances during a single journey. A few unlucky souls report seeing it every time they drive that stretch of road, as if they've been marked somehow, singled out for the highway repeater's attention. No photograph or video of the red hatchback has ever been successfully captured. Witnesses who've tried to record it report that their cameras or phones malfunction, batteries drain instantly, or the footage shows nothing where the hatchback should be. Derek Campbell no longer drives the A75 at night. He takes longer routes, adds hours to journeys, anything to avoid that stretch of road after sunset. Louise has never driven it again at all. She takes buses or trains or simply doesn't make trips that would require her to travel that road. But they know others aren't so fortunate. The A75 is a main route through southwestern Scotland, essential for travel between Dumfries and the ferry ports at Stranraer. Thousands of drivers use it every week, and some of them encounter the highway repeater. Local legends say that if you see the red hatchback 3 times in one journey, you should stop driving immediately. Find the nearest town, find a place to stay, and wait for daylight. Because the third appearance means it's not just following anymore, it's hunting. And those who continue driving after the third appearance sometimes don't reach their destination at all. The A75 remains one of Britain's most haunted roads. The highway repeater remains its most persistent ghost. And somewhere on that dark stretch of Scottish asphalt, a red hatchback continues its endless journey, following, appearing, vanishing, and repeating, forever trapped in a loop of road and night and unknowable purpose. U.S. Route 50 across central Nevada has been called the loneliest road in America, a designation that began as an insult from a travel magazine and became a badge of pride for those who know and love this harsh, beautiful, desolate corridor through the Great Basin. For 287 miles between Ely and Fernley, US 50 traverses landscape that seems more lunar than terrestrial. Vast alkaline flats stretch to distant mountain ranges. Ancient bristlecone pines cling to high elevation slopes. Ghost towns mark the locations where mineral booms briefly summoned civilization to this unforgiving desert before the mines played out and the people moved on. This is a road where you can drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle, where services, gas, food, water are separated by 80-mile intervals, where your cell phone is a useless brick of plastic and silicon, where the nearest help might be 3 hours away, where breaking down can be a death sentence if you're unprepared. The sky here is huge, overwhelming, filled with more stars than seem possible. During the day, the sun hammers the desert with merciless intensity. At night, temperatures can plummet 40 degrees and the darkness is absolute. No light pollution, no cities on the horizon, nothing but the void of the desert night. It's beautiful. It's terrifying. And according to dozens of witnesses over the decades, it's home to something that rides the highway after dark. Something that appears on a motorcycle and stares with eyes that are not eyes. Something that can't possibly exist but does. Tom Hendricks was a long-haul trucker specializing in freight transport across the American West. He'd driven every major highway in Nevada, had crossed the loneliest stretches dozens of times, and considered himself immune to the isolation and strangeness that unnerved, less experienced drivers. It was September 2008 when Tom had his encounter with the Night Rider, an experience that ended his career and left him with nightmares that persist to this day. He'd loaded cargo in Salt Lake City and was hauling electronics to Sacramento, taking US 50 across Nevada because it was the most direct route and he'd driven it successfully many times before. He left Ely around 8 p.m., planning to reach Fallon by 2 a.m., grab a few hours of sleep, and complete the run to Sacramento by morning. The night was perfect. Clear sky, no wind, temperature mild by desert standards. A full moon was rising, casting the landscape in silver light that made it feel otherworldly and beautiful. Tom had the windows down, enjoying the cool air, the radio playing classic rock at low volume. He was about 70 miles west of Ely, in a particularly desolate section where the highway runs straight for miles across an alkali flat, when he saw the motorcycle. At first it was just a light in his mirrors, a single bright headlight approaching from behind. Tom wasn't surprised. Motorcyclists did cross this stretch, though it took a certain kind of person to ride a bike across the loneliest road in America at night. But as the light drew closer, Tom's experienced eye noticed something wrong. The motorcycle was approaching at incredible speed, easily over 100 miles per hour, maybe much faster. And the sound was wrong. He should have been able to hear the engine, particularly on a bike moving that fast. The desert night carried sound for miles. But Tom heard nothing except the rumble of his own diesel engine. The motorcycle caught up to his truck in seconds and pulled alongside the cab, matching his speed. Tom looked down and felt his heart seize. The rider wore no helmet. His figure was almost translucent under the moonlight, as if he were made of fog or memory rather than flesh and bone. But it was his face, or what should have been his face, that turned Tom's blood to ice. Where eyes should have been, there were empty sockets. Not closed eyelids, not scars, just holes deep and black that seemed to bore into Tom with an intensity that eyes couldn't match. The rider's mouth was open in what might have been a scream or a grin, frozen in an expression that was neither human nor entirely inhuman. The motorcycle itself was wrong. Tom had seen thousands of bikes in his life, could identify makes and models at a glance. This one was generic, undefined, like someone's vague idea of what a motorcycle should look like rather than any actual machine. It had no visible manufacturer's marks, no license plate, no details that would make it a real object rather than an apparition. The night rider turned his eyeless face toward Tom. Their gazes met, or would have if the rider had possessed eyes. The sensation was like being struck by a physical force. Tom felt seen, studied, measured by an intelligence that was vast and cold and fundamentally inhuman. Then the rider accelerated. Not gradually, instantly. One moment he was beside Tom's cab, the next he was 100 yards ahead, 200, disappearing into the distance at a speed no earthly motorcycle could achieve, his single headlight dwindling to a point before vanishing entirely. Tom's hands were shaking on the wheel. He considered pulling over, stopping, trying to process what he'd seen. But the desert night suddenly felt hostile, full of watching presence, and the idea of sitting alone in his cab while something might be circling back terrified him more than continuing to drive. So he drove. He pushed his truck to its maximum safe speed, desperate to put distance between himself and wherever the night rider had gone. The miles rolled past, 5, 10, 20. The moon climbed higher, casting the desert in stark relief. Tom's radio had stopped working, producing only static despite the fact that he should have been able to pick up stations from Ely. 30 miles from his encounter, Tom saw the motorcycle again. It was ahead of him, parked in the middle of the highway, its rider sitting motionless astride it, facing Tom's approaching truck. The bike's headlight was off, but in the moonlight Tom could see the rider clearly. That translucent form, those empty eye sockets, that frozen expression. Tom's foot hovered over the brake. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to go anywhere except toward the thing waiting in the road. But there was nowhere to turn around. The highway was the only paved surface for miles, surrounded by desert that would shred his tires and strand him. And turning back meant driving toward Ely, hours behind him, with whatever the night rider was somewhere between him and safety. So Tom did the only thing he could. He kept driving, praying the rider would move, praying this was some kind of hallucination, praying he would wake up and discover this was all a nightmare. The distance closed, 200 yards, 100 yards, 50. Tom could see details now, the way the moonlight passed through the rider's form, the way his hands gripped the handlebars with fingers that were too long, too many joints. 25 yards. Tom's foot was on the brake, preparing for impact, knowing that hitting the motorcycle would destroy his truck and probably kill him, but unable to stop his momentum. 10 yards. The night rider and his bike simply vanished. Didn't move, didn't accelerate, vanished. One instant they occupied the highway, solid and real. The next instant there was nothing, just empty asphalt stretching away under the moon. Tom's truck rolled through the space where the motorcycle had been. Nothing. No impact, no sound, no evidence that anything had ever been there. Tom drove the remaining miles to Fallon in a state of shock, his mind unable to process what he'd experienced. He pulled into a truck stop, parked, and sat in his cab for 2 hours, staring at nothing, trying to convince himself he'd hallucinated the entire encounter. But he knew he hadn't. He'd been well rested, alert, sober. The night had been clear, visibility perfect. What he'd seen had been real as anything could be in a universe that had just revealed itself to be far stranger than he'd believed. Tom completed his delivery to Sacramento, then called his dispatcher and quit. After 20 years as a long-haul trucker, after hundreds of thousands of miles driving America's highways, he couldn't do it anymore. The roads he'd thought he knew, the landscape he'd thought he understood, had shown him something that shouldn't exist, and he couldn't unknow what he'd learned. Tom eventually shared his story in online forums dedicated to highway paranormal encounters. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of other drivers reported similar experiences on US 50 in Nevada. The details varied, but certain elements remained consistent. A motorcycle traveling at impossible speeds. A rider with no helmet and no face, or a face that was wrong, inhuman, incomplete. Empty eye sockets that nonetheless conveyed a sense of being watched, studied, measured. The motorcycle appearing suddenly, keeping pace with vehicles for a time, then vanishing or accelerating away at speeds that defied physics. Research revealed that the Night Rider legend predated motorcycles. In the 1860s, riders on the Pony Express route that preceded US 50 reported encounters with a phantom horseman who matched their pace before vanishing into the desert. In the early 1900s, when automobiles first crossed Nevada, drivers reported a mysterious cyclist who appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as mysteriously. The form changed with the times. Horse, bicycle, motorcycle. But the essence remained the same. Something that rode the desert night. Something that studied travelers and measured them with eyeless gaze. Something that had been there long before humans built roads through the wilderness, and would likely remain long after those roads crumbled to dust. Native American tribes who inhabited the Great Basin for thousands of years before European contact spoke of desert spirits, entities that took forms mimicking whatever travelers used, that studied humans with curiosity or malevolence, that could not be escaped or avoided because they existed outside the normal flow of time and space. Modern paranormal researchers have various theories. Some believe the Night Rider is a residual haunting, an echo of someone who died on that route and now endlessly repeats their final journey. Others suggest it's a cryptid, a creature adapted to the desert that mimics human technology to confuse or hunt prey. The most disturbing theory comes from physicists who study quantum mechanics and parallel realities. They suggest that in certain locations, thin places where the barriers between realities are weak, entities from parallel universes can briefly manifest in our world. The Night Rider in this theory isn't a ghost or a creature, but a traveler from a reality adjacent to our own. visible to us during those rare moments when the barrier's thin enough to allow crossing. U.S. Route 50 across Nevada remains one of America's most iconic and loneliest highways. Travelers still cross it, drawn by its stark beauty and the challenge of traversing such emptiness. But those who drive it at night, particularly during the full moon, sometimes encounter the night rider. The reports continue, a motorcycle approaching at impossible speed, a rider with no face and eyes that are empty voids, a presence that studies travelers with inhuman intelligence. And then, the vanishing, the impossible acceleration into the desert night, leaving witnesses to wonder what they've seen and whether they'll ever be able to forget. Tom Hendricks never returned to US 50. He took a job doing local deliveries in his home state of Oregon, routes where he's never more than 20 minutes from help, from people, from civilization. But the desert stays with him. In his dreams, he's back on the loneliest road in America, and in his mirrors he sees a single headlight approaching, growing closer. And he knows that this time the night rider won't simply study him and leave. This time, the night rider will stop, and Tom will finally see what lies behind those empty sockets, what intelligence inhabits that translucent form, what purpose drives the entity that has ridden the desert for centuries, appearing to travelers in whatever form they'll recognize as dangerous, as other, as fundamentally wrong. The desert remembers, the highway remembers, and somewhere on US 50 under the vast Nevada sky, the night rider continues his endless journey, waiting for the next traveler, the next encounter, the next moment when the barrier's thin and something impossible becomes briefly terribly real. Highways are meant to connect us, yet in the dark and the quiet, they also isolate us, sometimes from the safety of reality itself. Ghostly hitchhikers, phantom vehicles, and spectral riders linger at the edge of perception, often only seen when it's too late to react. So next time you drive alone at night, on a road that seems endless and empty, remember these stories. Watch for headlights that appear out of nowhere, figures standing silently by the roadside, and the uneasy feeling that you're being followed. Some travelers never truly leave the highway, and perhaps in those fleeting moments of fear and uncertainty you may glimpse them yourself. Because on the world's most haunted roads, the past isn't gone. It waits, and it watches.